The day Dorothy Wallace rode into Caldwell, Kansas. She did it astride a horse that half the town said a woman had no business riding, wearing trousers that the other half said a woman had no business wearing, and carrying a leather saddlebag full of surveying tools that every last soul in that sun-baked town of 1882 said a woman had absolutely no business touching. She did not slow her horse for any of them. Caldwell sat at the edge of the Cherokee Strip, a town that smelled of cattle and ambition, and the kind of desperate hope that only grows in places where the land stretches so wide and empty that a person either finds themselves or loses themselves completely. It was a border town in every sense of the word, the last stop before Indian Territory, the first stop for drovers pushing longhorns up from Texas, a place where fortunes were made and throats were cut, and nobody asked too many questions about where you came from as long as you kept your gun hand visible and your business your own. Dorothy Wallace was 26 years old, and she had been told what she could not do since before she could walk. Her father, a man of good intentions and narrow thinking, had told her she could not study mathematics beyond basic arithmetic because her mind was not built for numbers. Her teacher's instinct. Louis had told her she could not pursue surveying because it was a profession for men who could endure the heat and the rough terrain and the company of rough men. The land office in Topeka had told her she could not hold a survey contract in her own name because the paperwork required a male guarantor. The man she had almost married, a banker named Gerald Whitmore who wore his hair parted down the middle with the precision of a man who liked everything in its proper place, had told her she could not continue working after they were married, could not keep her instruments, could not keep her independence. She had given Gerald Whitmore back his ring on a Tuesday morning and been on a westbound train by Thursday afternoon. That had been 3 years ago, and in those 3 years she had carved out a living for herself that most men in her profession would have envied, if they had been willing to admit a woman was in her profession. She had surveyed land parcels in Nebraska, tracked property lines through the grasslands of the Kansas flats, and developed a reputation, quiet but persistent, for accuracy that no one could dispute no matter how much they wanted to. Her maps did not lie. The numbers did not bend to accommodate anyone's preferences or prejudices. And in a country where land disputes were settled with rifles and lawyers in roughly equal measure, a surveyor whose numbers you could trust was worth their weight in gold. She had come to Caldwell because of a contract. A man named Elias Birchfield had written to her through a land agent in Wichita, offering good money to survey the boundaries of a stretch of property just north of town. The land had been contested for 2 years between Birchfield, who ran cattle, and a group of settlers who had homesteaded there under the Homestead Act of 1862 and had paperwork of their own. Someone was lying about the lines, and Elias Birchfield was apparently confident enough in his position that he wanted an official survey on record. What he had not been told, or rather, what he had assumed wrong, was that the name D. Wallace on the correspondence belonged to a woman. Dorothy tied her horse at the rail outside the land office on Front Street and went inside, and the man behind the counter looked at her with the specific expression of a person encountering a fact that does not fit their expectations. A brief, confused blankness followed by the visible effort to reorganize the world into something that made sense again. "I am Dorothy Wallace," she said, before he could ask. "I have a contract with Elias Birchfield." The man behind the counter was named Hal Pickett, and he was not a bad man, but he was a man of his time and place, which meant that he recovered quickly from his surprise and moved with equal speed into obstruction. He told her, with the careful politeness of someone who believed he was doing her a kindness, that there must be some confusion, that the contract had been issued expecting a man, that the terrain north of town was rough going, not suitable for a lady, that perhaps she would be more comfortable waiting while he sent word to a colleague of hers who might be willing to take the work. Dorothy set her leather saddlebag on his counter with a deliberate thump. She opened it and produced the contract, the letter of correspondence, and her surveying certification from the Missouri School of Engineering, which was the only institution west of the Mississippi that had ever agreed to teach a woman the discipline, and only because the man who ran it in 1875 had two daughters he admired enormously, and a progressive streak that his colleagues found alarming. "The contract is in my name," she said. "The payment is to my name. I will begin the survey on Monday morning. Is there anything else you need from me today, Mr. Pickett?" Hal Pickett was not quite brave enough to hold his position against a woman who looked at him with that particular expression, calm, direct, not angry exactly, but not willing to be moved, and he stamped her paperwork with the reluctant air of a man who suspected he would regret it. Dorothy walked back out into the Caldwell afternoon and stood on the boardwalk, letting the sun hit her face, feeling the particular satisfaction of a small but solid victory. She had learned to collect these moments like coins, because the world spent them freely against her. She was looking for the hotel when she heard the argument. It was coming from the alley beside the feed store, two voices raised to the temperature just below actual violence, the hot, pressurized sound of men who had not yet decided whether words would be enough. Dorothy had good instincts about these things, honed by years of working in places where the wrong step could turn a professional disagreement into something considerably more dangerous. She told herself it was not her business. Then she heard one of the voices say, quite clearly, "You're going to deed me that land, or I am going to make sure you can't deed it to anyone." She was around the corner of the building before she had consciously decided to move. There were three men in the alley. Two of them were big, wearing the particular kind of worn-down clothes that suggested they were hired muscle rather than independent operators, men paid to be convincing rather than clever. The third man was leaner, somewhere in his early 30s, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face that had been lived in hard. He was backed against the wall with the calm of a man who was measuring distances and angles and deciding what his options were, which Dorothy recognized as the calculation of someone who had been in this kind of situation before. The two big men turned when she appeared. The lean man against the wall looked at her with an expression that she could only describe as surprised appreciation, not the kind that made her feel like an object, but the kind that suggested he was genuinely glad to see another human being regardless of the circumstances. "Afternoon," she said to the room at large. "This ain't your affair, lady," said the larger of the two hired men. "I am looking for the hotel," she said, which was true. "I appear to have made a wrong turn." "Hotel's on the main street," the man said. "You need to go back the way you came." "I will in just a moment." She looked at the lean man against the wall. "Are you all right?" He looked back at her with those measuring eyes, and something in his expression shifted a decision being made. "I'm fine," he said, "just finishing up a conversation." "Conversation looked like it was about finished to me," she said pleasantly. From the sound of it, the two hired men exchanged a look. The introduction of a witness, particularly a female one who would attract attention if anything happened to her, had changed the mathematics of the situation in ways that were not favorable to whatever they had been planning. After a moment of silent consultation, the larger one pointed a thick finger at the lean man. "This ain't over," he said. "Birchfield will hear about this." And they walked past Dorothy with the aggressive shuffle of men pretending they had chosen to leave, and she stepped aside to let them go, and then she was alone in the alley with the lean man who had straightened up from the wall and was watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "Thank you," he said. "I did not do very much," she said. "You did enough." He put out his hand. "Reuben Reed." She shook it. His grip was firm without being performative about it, the handshake of a man who had learned that the point of a handshake was connection rather than demonstration. "Dorothy Wallace." Something moved in his expression. "The surveyor." She blinked. "You know me." "I know of you," he said. "I've been waiting for you, actually. Or rather, I was hoping you'd get here before things got too complicated." He nodded toward the alley entrance. "Those two men work for Elias Birchfield, the same Elias Birchfield who hired you." Dorothy was quiet for a moment, reassembling the afternoon into a different shape. "Tell me," she said. He told her over coffee at the small restaurant attached to the hotel, sitting across from her at a table by the window while the light outside turned the color of old brass, and the sounds of Caldwell went about their business around them. Reuben Reed was, it turned out, one of the homesteaders whose land was in dispute. He had come to Caldwell from Ohio 4 years ago with his mother and his younger brother Thomas, had filed his homestead claim on 160 acres north of town under the Homestead Act, had built a house and a barn and broken the ground and put in crops, had done everything the law required of him. And then Elias Birchfield, who ran the largest cattle operation in the county and treated the countryside as his personal fiefdom, had decided he wanted that land back. He says the homestead claims were filed on land that was already in his grazing range, Reuben said. Says his cattle have been working that ground for 8 years, and we came in and fenced it illegally. "And your paperwork?" Dorothy asked. "Clear as can be. We're in compliance with every provision of the Homestead Act. I've got the registration documents. I've got the letters from the land office. The problem is that Birchfield has money and a lawyer and friends in positions of consequence, and we've got paperwork." He looked at her directly across the table. "When I heard a surveyor had been contracted, I was worried. A survey that supported Birchfield's version of the property lines would give him the legal basis to push us off the land by force if necessary." "He hired me," Dorothy said slowly. "I know. He presumably expects me to find in his favor." "I expect so." She looked at her coffee, then back at him. "I don't find in anyone's favor, Mr. Reed. I find what the measurements tell me. The lines are where they are, regardless of who pays for the survey." He nodded as if this was exactly what he had expected her to say, which made her look at him more carefully. Most men, when they found out she had been hired by the opposition, became adversarial. They pushed back. They tried to pressure her, bribe her, or replace her with someone more cooperative. This man was simply listening, with the particular quality of attention that suggested he believed what she said would be worth hearing. "I know that," he said. "I'm not asking you to work in my favor. I'm asking you to work accurately. That's all I need." Dorothy set down her coffee cup. She had been in this profession for 6 years, in this specific version of this conversation more times than she could easily count, and not one man had ever said that to her. Not one. They all wanted something: assurance, preference, confirmation of what they already believed. Even the ones with legitimate claims wanted her to slant in their direction. It was the nature of human desire in conflict with the neutrality required by good science. This man was sitting across from her in a restaurant in a border town in 1882, asking her simply to be accurate. She felt something warm happen in the vicinity of her chest and attributed it to the coffee. "Where are you homesteading?" she asked. He described the location, and she got out a small notebook. She always had a small notebook and sketched the rough geography while he talked. The homestead lay approximately 4 miles north of town, along a creek called Bitter Creek that nobody seemed sure how to feel about, in a stretch of land that had been contested because of a survey error in the original land office records that had placed 2 overlapping claims in the same section of ground. The error, if it existed, would have been made in 1874 when the land was first opened for settlement, and Birchfield's grazing claim predated the homestead claims by 2 years. "The key question," Dorothy said, "is whether the original survey marks are still in place, and whether Birchfield's grazing range was formally registered or simply assumed." "His lawyer says it was registered," Reuben said. "Then the registration document will have coordinates. I can check those against the physical markers and the legal descriptions." She looked up from her notebook. "It will take several days depending on the terrain." "The terrain is rough," he said, not as a warning, she noticed. "Just as information. "I've worked in rough terrain before," she said. He nodded. "I imagine you have." He did not add anything to that. He did not qualify it or follow it with a but or a however or a suggestion that she might want to bring along someone stronger or more experienced. He simply accepted the fact of her capability with a naturalness that made her feel, for a moment, slightly off balance, as if she had been leaning her weight against a door that had always resisted, and this time it had simply opened, and she had to catch herself from falling forward. "I will need access to the property," she said. "Yours and Birchfield's. You'll have mine without question." Birchfield might be more difficult. Birchfield hired me. He cannot refuse me access if he wants the survey to hold up in any court. She made another note. "I will send word to his office in the morning." Reuben watched her write with the same quality of attention he had given everything else, not staring, not performing his observation, just genuinely present in the way that some people are and most people are not. She became aware of it in the peripheral way you become aware of sunlight, not by looking directly at it but by feeling it on your skin. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask," she said, which was her standard answer to that particular preamble. "Why are you still here? In Caldwell, I mean. Most people in your position, once they knew Birchfield had hired them, would have found a reason to reassign the contract." She thought about that for a moment. It was a fair question. "Because I don't walk away from things I've committed to," she said. "And because the survey needs to happen regardless of who paid for it. If the homesteaders are right, the survey will prove it. If Birchfield is right, the survey will prove that too. Either way, accurate numbers are better than no numbers. Even if Birchfield pressures you, those two men in the alley were a warning of what he's willing to do. Were they meant for me or for you?" He paused. "For me, today. But he'll know soon enough that you're not going to hand him what he wants just because he's paying." "Then I suppose I'll deal with that when it comes," she said. "I've been dealing with men who did not like my answers for a long time." He did not tell her that she should be careful. He did not tell her she should reconsider. He did not suggest that she find someone else to manage the Birchfield problem while she handled the measurements, as if the measurements were the ladylike part and the conflict management was the part that required trousers and nerve. He said, "All right. Is there anything you need from me to get started?" And she looked at him again with that same slight sensation of unexpected openness, the door that was not resisting, and she thought that he was a genuinely unusual person. "Tell me more about the creek," she said, "specifically where it changes course. That's usually where the surveyors get it wrong." He told her about the creek, and she wrote it all down, and outside the window Caldwell went about its evening business, and somewhere across town Elias Birchfield was presumably being told by his hired men that something had not gone according to plan, and the summer of 1882 settled over the Kansas plains like a heavy warm blanket, full of stars and consequence. Reuben Reed walked her back to the hotel when the restaurant closed, which was the kind of town where restaurants closed early because everyone had worked before dawn. They walked on the boardwalk, and the night air smelled of dust and cottonwood and the distant, rich scent of cattle that was always somewhere on the wind this far south in Kansas. "Your mother and brother," she said as they walked, because she was curious, and she had found it was usually better to be directly curious than to pretend otherwise. "They're on the homestead now. Thomas is. He's 22. Good farmer, better than me actually. He's got a patience for it I've never quite had. My mother passed 2 winters ago." He said it simply, without performing grief, just stating a fact that mattered. She made it through the first 2 years, which were the hard ones. She died in her own house on her own land, which she said was more than she'd expected when we left Ohio. "I'm sorry about your mother," Dorothy said. "Thank you. She would have liked you, I think." Dorothy glanced at him. "You don't know me." "I know enough to know she would have liked you." He said it without embarrassment, matter-of-factly, the way he seemed to say everything. She was a practical woman with strong opinions, and she had no patience for people who tried to put her in boxes she didn't fit. Dorothy was quiet for a moment, feeling the warmth again in her chest, more noticeable this time. That sounds like a compliment. It is the highest one I know how to give. They stopped at the hotel door and she put out her hand, and he shook it in the same way he had in the alley, firm and genuine and without anything extra in it. "I'll ride out to the homestead Monday morning," she said. "If you can show me the boundary markers, that will save me a day." "I'll be ready," he said. She went inside and climbed the stairs to her room, and she stood at the small window that looked out over Front Street and watched him walk away down the boardwalk with the easy stride of a man who was comfortable in the space he occupied in the world. Not swaggering, not performing, just moving with a quiet assurance that had nothing to prove. She had been told by many men many things she could not do, and she had spent the better part of her adult life proving them wrong, one careful measurement at a time. She had gotten very good at it. She had also, she realized, gotten very used to the weight of it, the constant friction of having to justify her presence, defend her expertise, argue for her right to simply do her work. Standing at that window watching Reuben Reed disappear around the corner toward the livery stable, Dorothy Wallace felt, for the first time in a long time, the strange lightness of a moment in which that friction had simply not been there. She slept better than she expected to. Monday morning came in hot and clear, the way Kansas mornings do in July, with a sky so blue and enormous it made you feel simultaneously very small and very glad to be alive. Dorothy was saddled and on the road north of town by 7 in the morning, her saddlebag full of instruments, a surveying compass, a measuring chain, a level, her notebook and her mind organized into the particular clear, purposeful state that always came when she was beginning a new survey. Reuben was waiting at the gate of the homestead when she arrived, as he had said he would be. He was on horseback, wearing a plain work shirt and the kind of hat that had been new a long time ago. Thomas was there too, visible at the edge of a cornfield, a younger and slightly broader version of his brother with the same dark eyes and a more openly friendly expression. He waved when she rode up. "Miss Wallace," Reuben said, "glad you made it. Were you worried I wouldn't?" "I was a little worried," he admitted. "Birchfield's man came by here yesterday afternoon. I thought maybe he'd gone to talk you out of the survey." "His man came to the hotel yesterday morning," she said. "He told me that the terrain north of town was too rough for a woman to survey safely and that Mr. Birchfield would be willing to recommend a more experienced colleague." Reuben's expression shifted in a way that was not quite anger, something cooler and more contained. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that the contract was legally binding, that I would begin Monday morning as agreed, and that if Mr. Birchfield attempted to interfere with the survey, I would note it in my official report and make that report available to the court." She looked at him. "His man left fairly quickly after that." Reuben made a sound that was close to a laugh. "You're not what Birchfield expected." "I rarely am what anyone expects," she said. "Show me the east boundary marker." They rode the property together for the better part of that first day, and Dorothy worked with the systematic thoroughness that had made her reputation. She measured distances with the chain, checked bearings with the compass, made notes at every established marker, and cross-referenced everything against the land office documents she had brought with her. Reuben rode with her, holding the back end of the chain when she needed it held, holding her horse when she needed to climb down into creek beds or up onto rises to get proper sightlines. He did these things without being asked and without making a production of them, moving to where he was needed with the same quiet efficiency he seemed to bring to everything. He also did not talk too much, which she valued. Some people, nervous in her presence or determined to seem helpful, talked constantly when she was working, filling the silence with chatter that made the measurements harder. Reuben seemed to understand that the work required concentration, and he gave her that concentration without being asked. When she wanted to talk, she talked. When she didn't, the silence between them was easy and comfortable, the kind of silence that takes a while to develop between people who don't know each other well, and yet It was there almost immediately. Around noon, they stopped near the creek and ate the lunch that Thomas had packed for them: bread and cold chicken and 2 apples. And Dorothy showed Reuben the measurements she had taken that morning and what they were beginning to tell her. "The east boundary marker is in the right place," she said, spreading her notebook on the grass between them. "That's consistent with your land office documents. The question is the northwest corner, where Birchfield says the lines overlap. That's where I need to spend tomorrow." "The northwest corner is rough going," he said. "There's a limestone ridge and then a drop down to the creek. The original surveyors, the ones who laid out the sections in '74, they may have cut a corner there because of the terrain." "That's what I expect," she said. "And if they did, the question becomes which recorded document reflects the actual survey and which reflects what the surveyor wished he'd measured." She took a bite of her apple. "In my experience, when there's a dispute about boundary lines, 90% of the time it's because a surveyor 40 years ago was cold or tired or in a hurry and fudged a measurement, and everyone downstream has been fighting about the fudge ever since. And the other 10%, someone is lying on purpose." He nodded slowly. "Which do you think this is?" She looked at the measurements in her notebook, at the pattern that was beginning to emerge from the numbers, at the slight but consistent discrepancy she had noticed between the land office description of Birchfield's grazing claim and the actual position of the markers. "I don't form conclusions before I have all the data," she said, "but I'll tell you what I find when I have it." "That's fair," he said. He was lying back on one elbow in the grass, looking at the sky with the relaxed posture of a man who had learned to take rest where he found it. "Father used to say that a man who tells you his conclusion before he's done the work is selling you something. Your father sounds like he was sensible. He was, mostly. He also thought that farming in Ohio was going to provide for us, and that was less sensible." He paused. "He died when I was 21, before we came west." "Was coming west your idea?" He was quiet for a moment. "It was mine and my mother's together. Thomas was too young to have much say, but we all wanted it, I think. We all wanted something larger." He looked over at her. "You know what that's like, I imagine." She did know. She knew it in the particular, bone-deep way of someone who had felt the smallness of a life that other people were trying to define for her, and had chosen to walk out of it toward something bigger, even when bigger was uncertain and rough, and required riding into towns where nobody expected you, and standing your ground at counters where men looked at you like a fact that didn't fit their world. "I do," she said. They rode back to the homestead in the late afternoon, and Reuben's brother Thomas insisted she stay for supper, with the cheerful forcefulness of a younger man who cooked well and liked company. The house was plain but solid. Reuben had built it himself over the first winter, Thomas told her with obvious pride, working with a neighbor named Caleb Marsh who had a gift for carpentry. It had 2 rooms, a front room that served as kitchen and living space, and a smaller room in the back. It was clean and practical, and had the particular quality of a home that was not pretending to be anything other than what it was. Dorothy ate salt pork and boiled potatoes and fresh corn, and Thomas talked enough for all 3 of them, describing with infectious enthusiasm the progress of the corn crop, and the complications of the well and the ongoing negotiations with a badger who had decided that the root cellar was his territory. Reuben ate and listened, and occasionally added a dry correction when Thomas's storytelling got too colorful, and Dorothy found herself smiling more than she had in months. "You'll come back tomorrow?" Thomas asked when she was preparing to leave. "I'll come back tomorrow and the day after," she said. "I need to finish the northwest corner survey." "We've got a spare room," Thomas said. "You could stay here instead of riding back and forth to Caldwell every day." Dorothy glanced at Reuben, who was looking at his brother with an expression of mild exasperation. "That is generous of you," Dorothy said carefully. "I appreciate the offer, but I think it's better for all of us given the circumstances if I stay in town." "Because of Birchfield," Thomas said, without self-consciousness. He was the kind of young man whose thoughts arrived on his face before he could arrange them. "Among other reasons," she said. Reuben stood and walked with her to where her horse was tied. The evening had softened the heat, and the sky in the west was a spectacular gradient of amber and rose, the kind of sunset that the Kansas plains do better than anywhere else because there is so much sky to do it in. "He means well," Reuben said quietly. "He's not subtle." "He's charming," she said. "You can tell him I said so." She untied her horse. "I'll be back at 7. "I'll be here." He paused. "Dorothy." She looked at him. It was the first time he had used her given name, and she registered it with a small internal shift, the way you register a change in air pressure before a storm. "Be careful on the road back. It gets dark fast out here. Not be careful because you're a woman. Not be careful because you shouldn't be out alone. Just be careful on the road back," the way he would have said it to anyone riding alone on a Kansas road at dusk. "I will," she said. "Good night, Reuben." She rode back to Caldwell as the stars came out one by one, and the prairie made its nighttime sounds around her, and she thought about measurements and discrepancies and the specific quality of a man who moved through the world without needing to make himself larger by making others smaller. The Northwest Corner survey took 2 full days, as she had expected. The terrain was difficult. The limestone ridge was steep, and the footing was poor, and the creek below made a sharp bend that she had not anticipated from the land office maps, which was significant because the bend was recent, geologically speaking, no more than 10 or 15 years old based on the bank erosion, and the original 1874 survey would have recorded the creek's earlier course. On the second day, working along the base of the ridge with her compass and her chain while Reuben held the back marker pole with steady patience, she found what she had been looking for. Or rather, she found what the measurement had been trying to tell her since Monday morning. "Come here," she said. "I need you to hold this." He came, moving carefully over the rocky ground, and held the chain end where she indicated. She walked the measurement twice to be sure, then stood and looked at the number in her notebook for a long time. "What do you see?" he asked. "The 1874 survey placed the section corner at a point that is now in the middle of Bitter Creek," she said, "because the creek has moved. The bend moved approximately 90 feet to the northwest between 1874 and now." She showed him the notebook, which means that when Birchfield registered his grazing claim, he used the 1874 survey coordinates as the northwest boundary of his range. He registered land up to those coordinates. Reuben was looking at the notebook, but those coordinates are now in the creek, and 50 feet into what is now, by those same original coordinates, your homestead claim. She looked at him. Birchfield's registered grazing claim does not actually include the land he says it does, because the reference point he used is no longer on land. His attorney may not have known that, or he may have known and hoped no one would check. She paused. The homestead claims, on the other hand, are registered using the current physical markers, not the 1874 coordinates, which puts you firmly within your legal claim. Reuben was very quiet for a moment. Below them, the creek moved over its limestone bed, indifferent to the human drama it had caused by meandering 90 feet to the northwest over the past decade. "You're sure?" he said. "I will run these numbers 3 times before I put them in my report," she said. "But yes, I'm sure." He sat down on a limestone rock and put his hands on his knees and looked at the creek for a long moment. His face was doing something complicated: relief and something heavier mixed together, the expression of a man who had been carrying a weight for so long that the prospect of putting it down was almost harder than the carrying. "My mother," he said quietly. "She died worried about this. She spent the last months of her life worried we were going to lose the land." Dorothy was quiet. She did not have a word for the particular kind of sorrow in his voice, the grief that was not just for the death but for what the person had carried into it. She sat down on a rock near him, not too close, and let the moment be what it was. "She would have been glad to know," she said finally. "Yes," he said, "she would." They sat for a while longer on their limestone rocks above the creek, and the afternoon moved around them, And then he looked up at her with the direct, clear gaze that she had come to recognize as particular to him. "Thank you," he said. "Not just for the survey. For doing it honestly. You didn't have to. Birchfield hired you. You could have. Most people would have found a way to produce numbers that kept the contract holder happy." "I told you on the first day," she said. "I don't produce numbers for people. I produce numbers for the land." "I know. That's what I'm thanking you for." She looked away across the creek, not because she was embarrassed, but because the directness of his gratitude was doing something to her that she needed a moment to organize. In 6 years of professional work, she had been thanked many times. She had been thanked perfunctorily. She had been thanked with the patronizing warmth of a man who was surprised she had done a good job. She had been thanked with ulterior motives. She had occasionally been thanked genuinely. But she could not think of a time she had been thanked like this, with such complete acknowledgement of the actual thing she had done, without qualification or condescension, without even the implicit suggestion that her honesty was remarkable specifically because she was a woman. He had thanked her the way he would have thanked anyone who had done hard work honestly, and somehow that was more moving than any elaborate praise. "We should finish the measurements," she said. "I want to have the report ready to file by Thursday." "All right," he said, and stood, and they went back to work. She filed her report with the Caldwell Land Office on Thursday afternoon, with copies to the court in Wichita and to Elias Birchfield's attorney, whose name was Mercer Crane and who was, by all accounts, a man who prided himself on never being surprised. He was surprised. Dorothy was still in Hal Pickett's office when a boy came running from the telegraph office with a message from Crane saying that the survey findings were incomplete and that he would need to review the methodology before accepting them. Dorothy wrote her response in Pickett's office, standing at his counter while he watched with an expression of bemused uncertainty. The methodology was complete, fully documented, and available for review. Any questions could be directed to her at the Caldwell Hotel. She was available between 9 and noon on weekdays. Pickett stamped the documents with an expression that had moved over the course of the week, from reluctant obstruction to something closer to respect. "You know Birchfield is going to push back hard on this," he said. "I know," she said. "He's got a lot of friends in this county." "He has friends and I have measurements," she said. "In my experience, measurements win." She left the land office and was halfway across Front Street when she nearly walked into Reuben Reed, who was coming from the direction of the general store with a sack of flour over one shoulder and a look of pleased surprise. "It's filed," he said. "Delivered and stamped. Crane will contest it, but the numbers are the numbers." She fell into step beside him. "How are you feeling about it?" "Like a man who hasn't slept well in 2 years and can see the possibility of sleeping well again," he said. "Like a man who wants to buy the surveyor who did this a very good dinner if she'll permit it." Dorothy looked at him. She was aware, suddenly and with great clarity, of several things at once. That she had been thinking about Reuben Reed at odd moments since Sunday evening, that she had been thinking specifically about the way he listened, and the way he moved through space, and the easy, unforced quality of his presence. That she had catalogued these thoughts in the part of her mind where she kept things she was not yet ready to examine. And that standing in the middle of Front Street on a Thursday afternoon in Caldwell, Kansas, she had apparently run out of space in that part of her mind. "I'll permit it," she said. He smiled. It was the first time she had seen him smile fully. She had seen the near smiles, the dry half-expressions of amusement, but this was a complete smile, and it changed his whole face into something that she felt in her solar plexus in an embarrassingly direct way. 7 o'clock, he said. 7 o'clock, she agreed. She went back to her hotel room and sat on the edge of the bed and had a very frank conversation with herself about what was happening. She was not a woman who avoided clear thinking, even when clear thinking was uncomfortable. She was 26 years old. She was in the middle of a contract in a border town. She had a professional relationship with this man that was not fully concluded. And she was sitting on the edge of a hotel bed in Caldwell, Kansas, aware that she was looking forward to 7 o'clock with the specific, particular anticipation that she had not felt since she was 19 years old and had been fool enough to feel it about Gerald Whitmore. Gerald Whitmore had looked at her and seen a woman he could shape. A woman who could be managed into the appropriate form for a banker's wife, who could be pointed in the right direction and expected to stay there. Reuben Reed looked at her and saw Dorothy Wallace, surveyor, the person who was actually there doing the actual work with full capability and full authority. She thought that was a significant difference. She put on the nicer of her two dresses. She had brought two, one for working, one for the rare occasion when working clothes were inappropriate, and went down to the restaurant at 7. He was already there, and he had clearly made some effort with his own appearance, the worn hat nowhere in evidence, his dark hair combed back with the slightly self-conscious neatness of a man who did not care much about grooming, but had decided to care about it tonight. He stood when she came to the table, which was a reflex of courtesy that she noticed but did not require. "You look," he started, then stopped. "I look," she prompted, amused. "Different," he said. "Not different from how I expected, just different from the field." He sat back down. "That was not an elegant thing to say." "It was an honest thing to say," she said. "Which is more valuable?" The restaurant in the Caldwell Hotel served a serviceable beefsteak and passable potatoes, and the kind of pie that suggested there was a woman in the kitchen who was doing what she could with limited resources. They ate and they talked, and the talking was entirely different from the professional conversation of the past week, wider and deeper, and with a quality of mutual discovery that Dorothy had not experienced in conversation since she was in school, arguing about mathematics and philosophy with the few professors who would argue back. She told him about St. Louis, about her father's insurance office, and her mother's beautiful, quiet frustration with a life that had been too small for her, about how she had recognized that frustration and determined not to replicate it. She told him about the engineering school and the professor with 2 daughters who had let her in, and about the first time she had stood in a field with a surveying chain in her hands and understood that she had found the thing she was meant to do. He told her about Ohio, about the exhaustion of trying to farm land that had been farmed by 3 generations before you and was giving up its productivity grudgingly, about the conversation with his dying father that had planted the idea of the West, about the train journey west with his mother and 15-year-old Thomas, about arriving in Kansas and seeing for the first time what it meant to have a horizon that never ended. "You first saw it," she said. "The plains, what did you feel?" He thought about it carefully, the way she had come to expect from him. "Terror," he said, "and then something else that I still don't have a good word for. Like the terror and the open space were the same thing, and whether it was wonderful or terrible depended on whether you were willing to be that small." He looked at her. "What did you feel?" "The first time I rode out on open ground," she considered. "Possible," she said. "I felt possible." He looked at her in a way that she felt all the way to her fingertips. "Yes," he said quietly, "that's the word." After dinner he walked her to the hotel stairs, and they stood in the narrow hallway at the bottom of the staircase, and neither of them was in a particular hurry to conclude the evening. "My report will be official in about 10 days," she said. "After that you should hear from the land office about the status of the claim." "And what will you do?" he asked. "After the report is official, is there other work bringing you to Caldwell?" There was not. She had 3 other contract inquiries she had been corresponding about, 1 in Colorado and 2 in Nebraska, and she had been intending to take the first train west after her work here was complete. She had been intending that since before she arrived, with the comfortable certainty of a woman who had learned to keep moving, because staying put had historically meant being put in the right place by other people's expectations. "I'm not entirely sure," she said, which surprised her as it came out of her mouth. It seemed to surprise him slightly too, or perhaps he was surprised by something else, by the honesty of it, by the fact that she had left the door to the answer open rather than closing it with professional finality. "I ask," he said, "because I'd like to see you again." When this isn't, he made a small gesture with his hand that indicated the survey, the dispute, the professional complexity that had framed everything since Sunday. When it's just this. Dorothy looked at him in the lamplight of the hotel hallway. She thought about all the men who had told her what she could not do, and about what it felt like to spend so much of her life pressing against resistance. And she thought about this man, who had been pressing against his own resistances for 4 years, the land, the drought, Birchfield's men in the alley, and had not let any of them make him smaller or harder or less genuinely present in the world. "I think I'd like that too," she said. He nodded, and the smile came again, quieter this time, more interior, the kind of smile that belongs to a person, not to a social situation. "Good night, Dorothy. Good night, Reuben." She climbed the stairs with the very deliberate composure of a woman trying not to feel too giddy, and failed only slightly. Mercer Crane arrived in Caldwell on Friday with 2 colleagues from his Wichita firm, and a briefcase full of arguments about survey methodology. And Dorothy spent the better part of that morning in Hal Pickett's office, methodically disassembling every objection, with the patient thoroughness of a person who has been right before, and knows what right feels like. Crane was a skilled lawyer and not an unintelligent man, but he was operating under the disadvantage of needing to find errors in work that did not have errors. He challenged her calibration of the compass, and she showed him the documentation of its last certification. He challenged her interpretation of the creek's historic course, and she produced a geological report from the Kansas State Board of Agriculture that corroborated her assessment of the creek's movement. He challenged the validity of the physical markers she had used, and she showed him the photographs she had taken with the small camera she carried for exactly these disputes, showing the markers in situ with her measuring chain beside them for scale. By noon, Crane had retreated to technical objections so narrow that Pickett, who was not a surveyor and had no particular stake in the outcome, was having visible difficulty maintaining a professional expression. "Mr. Crane," Dorothy said, at the point where he began suggesting that the angle of her compass readings might have been affected by proximity to the limestone ridge, "I have been a licensed surveyor for 6 years. I have surveyed properties in 4 states and 1 territory. I have had my work challenged in 3 courts of law and prevailed in all 3. I am happy to continue this conversation for as long as you find it productive, but I want to be clear that the measurements I filed on Thursday are accurate, reproducible, and legally defensible. If Mr. Birchfield wishes to commission a second survey, he is welcome to do so. Any accurate second survey will confirm my findings." Crane looked at her for a long moment, with the expression of a man whose professional dignity was engaged in combat with his professional honesty. "I'll need to advise my client," he said finally. "Of course," she said. He left with his colleagues, and Pickett looked at Dorothy with open admiration. "I've watched a lot of people argue in this office," he said. "You might be the best I've seen." "I'm not arguing," she said. "I'm explaining. The argument would have to come from their side, and they don't have one." Elias Birchfield was a man who had spent 40 years getting what he wanted through a combination of money, influence, and the baseline assumption that the world would accommodate him. He was not, in the end, above the law, but he was a long time in accepting that. He disputed the survey findings formally through Crane's office for another 3 weeks, during which Dorothy remained in Caldwell and answered every objection, and attended every meeting, and did not, at any point, give ground that was not supported by measurement. During those 3 weeks, she also spent a great deal of time on the Reed homestead that had nothing to do with the survey. It happened naturally, in the gradual way that things happen when 2 people have already established that they like each other and enjoy the same kind of work, and have found, between them, a conversational register that makes ordinary time feel larger and more interesting than it usually does. She began writing out on days when there was no official business to conduct, ostensibly to verify a measurement or check a marker, which was true but not the primary reason. Reuben was always there, or nearly always. They walked the fence lines together, and she helped Thomas with the corn on a Tuesday afternoon when his back was giving him trouble, and they rode up to the ridge above Bitter Creek on a Sunday evening to watch the sunset. It was on the ridge, on that Sunday evening, with the Kansas sky doing its magnificent Amber and Rose performance and the plains stretching away in every direction, that Reuben told her about the letter. "I had a letter from a land agent in Colorado," he said, 2 months ago before all this started. He's representing a consortium that wants to consolidate homestead claims in the southern part of the territory, paying above market value, he says, for 5-year-old claims in good condition. Dorothy looked at him. "Are you thinking of selling?" "I was," he said. "Before the dispute became what it became, I was considering it. Thomas and I talked about it. The money would have set us up for several years." He paused. "Now that the claim is secure, I don't think I want to sell. I think I want to stay." She was quiet for a moment, watching the sun touch the edge of the plains. "What changed?" she asked, and she was aware that she was asking a question with more than one answer. He looked at her. "Several things," he said. The silence that followed was the good kind, full rather than empty, the silence of two people who have arrived at a moment of understanding and are not quite ready to put it into words and don't need to yet. "I've been thinking about where I might go next," she said, "after the Birchfield business is concluded." "Colorado," he said. "You mentioned contract inquiries." "Colorado is one option." She let the sentence rest without finishing it, which was the most deliberately vague thing she had said in a long time, because she was not a vague person by nature. Reuben turned to look at her with his full attention, which she had come to know as a specific quality of presence that he brought to moments that mattered. "Dorothy," he said, "I want to say something, and I want to say it plainly because I don't know how to say it otherwise." "Please do," she said. "I have thought about you every day since the night I met you in that alley. Not because of the survey, though the survey is important. Because of you. The way you think and the way you work and the way you are in the world." He paused. "I'm not trying to say anything that makes assumptions about what you want or what you're planning. I know you have a life that works and a career that matters to you, and I would never ask you to diminish any of that. But I want you to know that if there is any version of your plans that includes staying in Caldwell, or includes coming back to Caldwell, I would like very much to be a reason for that." Dorothy Wallace had been proposed to once formally by Gerald Whitmore with a ring from a jewelry store in St. Louis. She had been courted with flowers and poems by a young man in Nebraska who had romantic feelings and no understanding of her whatsoever. She had been told by various men over the years that she was admirable in the way that men describe qualities in women they plan to later work against. She had never been spoken to like this, with such complete honesty, such complete absence of pressure, such complete willingness to want without demanding. "I am not certain what my plans are," she said carefully, "but I know that they were clearer in my mind before I came to Caldwell, and they are less clear now, and I think that is your doing." He looked at her with an expression she had no word for, open and warm and a little odd, as if he had been hoping for something, and the getting of it was still startling. "That seems fair," he said. She laughed. She had not expected to laugh, but it burst out of her with the genuine spontaneity of laughter that is not performed, and he laughed too, and they sat there on the ridge above Bitter Creek as the stars came out over Kansas, and the horizon went dark and enormous around them. Later that evening, riding back toward town in the early dark, he caught up his horse beside hers and they rode in easy parallel, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence on her left side. And when his hand reached across the small distance between their horses and found hers and held it, she let it, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Mercer Crane withdrew the formal objection to the survey on the 14th of August, 1882, which meant that the land office findings became official, and the Reed homestead claim was confirmed on record as legally distinct from, and not in conflict with, Elias Birchfield's registered grazing range. Birchfield himself came to the land office that afternoon and signed the acknowledgement document, with the rigid posture of a man absorbing a defeat he had not anticipated. And he looked at Dorothy once across the room with an expression that she acknowledged without flinching, because she had looked at many expressions like it, and had learned a long time ago that they had no power over accurate numbers. Hal Pickett shook her hand afterward, warmly and without any residual awkwardness, and told her she had done a fine piece of work. It was a straightforward survey, she said. The land was never in any real doubt. The land wasn't, he said meaningfully, and she understood that he meant the people arguing about it had been in considerable doubt as to the outcome. Reuben was waiting outside on the boardwalk when she came out, not because he had known when the official confirmation would happen, but because he had made a habit over the past week of finding reasons to be on Front Street in the afternoons, which she found both transparent and entirely charming. "It's done," she told him. He closed his eyes for a moment, and she saw the relief move through him like water, through his shoulders and his jaw and the set of his hands. When he opened his eyes, he was looking at her with an expression of such uncomplicated gratitude and warmth that she felt it like sunlight. "Come out to the homestead tomorrow," he said. "I want to show you something." She came the next morning to find that Thomas, who had been conspicuously absent the previous several visits, had ridden to town on invented errands with the cheerful unconvincingness of a 22-year-old running a scheme. Reuben showed her through the back pasture to a rise above the property where the grass was tall and the view was long, and he had brought a blanket and a basket, because it was the kind of morning that invited being outside in it. They sat in the grass on the rise with the whole of the homestead below them, the house and the barn, the cornfield, the kitchen garden that Thomas maintained with the particular devotion of a young man who had strong opinions about vegetables, and ate bread and cold ham and the good late summer apples that grew in a small thicket along the east fence. "I want to show you this," Reuben said, "because I want you to see it the way I see it, not as a legal dispute or a survey parcel, as a place." She looked at the homestead below them, at the house that he had built with his own hands in a Kansas winter, at the fields that had given 3 harvests since he planted the first one, at the land that his mother had died on and that Thomas was growing into. She looked at it and she understood what he was showing her. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. "It could be more," he said quietly. "It has always felt like it was missing something. I didn't know what until recently." She looked at him. "I'm not asking you to give anything up," he said. "I want to be very clear about that. I know who you are and I know what your work means to you, and I would never want you to become less than you are on my account. But I want you to know that if you wanted to build something here, not instead of your work, alongside it, I would spend every day of my life making sure that this was a place where you could be exactly and fully yourself." Dorothy was quiet for a long moment, looking at the land below and then back at this man beside her, this man who had been told things all his life too, that Ohio farming was a sufficient destiny, that a small life was a safe life, that the West was too wild and too uncertain for a family, and who had chosen anyway to come West and build something real. She thought about the door that had always pushed back. She thought about how it had felt when it opened. "Reuben," she said. "Yes," he said, as if her saying his name was itself a complete thought. "I have 3 contract inquiries, Colorado and 2 in Nebraska. They will take me away from Caldwell for a good part of the next year." She met his eyes steadily. "I am not someone who will stop working. I need you to understand that clearly." "I understand it," he said. "I wouldn't want you to. When I'm done with each contract, I would need to come back to somewhere." She paused. "I have not had a somewhere in a long time." "You could have one here," he said, "if you wanted it." "I think," she said, with the careful deliberateness of a person making a decision that has been forming for weeks, "that I want it." He reached out and touched her face with the same quality of attention he gave to everything fully present, unhurried, without anything to prove. And she leaned into that hand, and the Kansas morning was enormous and clear around them, and she thought that this was what possible felt like from the inside. He kissed her. It was not the first time she had been kissed, but it was the first time she had been kissed by someone who kissed her the same way he did everything else, with complete presence and no performance, as if she was exactly who he had been hoping to find at the end of a very long trip through difficult country. Thomas came back from town at noon, riding with the theatrical casualness of someone who had been watching the clock and decided that noon was a reasonable amount of time to give people. And when he found them still sitting on the rise in the grass talking with the comfortable closeness of people who had crossed some interior distance, he gave Reuben a look of enormous satisfaction that he made no attempt whatsoever to conceal. "Are you staying for lunch?" he asked Dorothy. "She's staying," Reuben said. Thomas's face broke into a grin that took up most of it. "Good," he said, and headed for the kitchen with the happy purposefulness of a young man who had been hoping very hard for a specific outcome and had gotten it. Dorothy stayed for lunch and for the afternoon, and she told them about the Colorado contract, a substantial land survey for a mining operation northeast of Pueblo, and Reuben got out a map, and they spread it on the kitchen table and looked at it together. He asked careful, intelligent questions about the terrain and the season, and Thomas asked enthusiastic questions about whether she had ever been to Colorado, and the afternoon became evening while nobody particularly noticed. She rode back to Caldwell as the sunset lit the plains behind her, feeling the specific happiness of a person who has come to a place where something is beginning rather than ending. Over the next 3 weeks, before she left for Colorado, she and Reuben built the structure of what their life together would look like. And they built it the way she built everything, carefully, with accurate measurements, accounting for the actual terrain rather than the terrain they wished existed. She would take the Colorado contract, which would run from mid-September through November. She would come back to Caldwell for Christmas. In the new year, she would negotiate the Nebraska contracts on a schedule that allowed her to be on the homestead for significant stretches between field work. Reuben, for his part, had a practical proposal for expanding the homestead operation in a way that would generate enough income to support a family, which Thomas was already enthusiastic about, and which involved bringing in a second neighbor family as working partners in an arrangement that was common enough in the homesteading community to be well understood. And on a warm Saturday in early September, 1882, in the parlor of the Caldwell Hotel, because neither of them wanted a ceremony they would have to spend much of the day managing, Dorothy Wallace and Reuben Reed made their intentions formally known to each other in front of a county judge named Morrison, who charged $2, and did not seem to find anything unusual about a female surveyor in a good dress marrying a farmer in a clean shirt on a Saturday morning. Thomas Reed cried, which he denied afterward, and which both Dorothy and Reuben agreed they had not noticed. Hal Pickett shook both their hands outside the hotel afterward, and said it was the best outcome he had seen come out of a property dispute in 10 years, which was the highest form of professional praise available in Caldwell, Kansas. Dorothy left for Colorado 3 days later with her saddlebag of instruments and her surveying chain, and the quiet but absolute knowledge that there was a place she was coming back to. She had not had that before, the particular assurance of a return, and she found that it did not constrain her the way she had feared it might. It did the opposite. It made the leaving easier, because leaving from somewhere is entirely different from simply going, and she had been simply going for a long time. Colorado was everything a difficult survey should be: hard ground, altitude, competing interests, a mining operation representative who argued constantly until she showed him the numbers, at which point he stopped arguing and became grudgingly respectful in the way that people do when they have run out of wrong things to say. She surveyed in the cold autumn air at altitude, and sent letters back to Caldwell that were more personal and more detailed than she had expected to write, and received letters back from Reuben that were not flowery or elaborate, but were entirely themselves, clear and direct, and full of the specific texture of daily life on the homestead, the weather and the harvest, and Thomas's ongoing conflict with the badger, which had by now escalated to the level of a sustained campaign. She came back to Caldwell for Christmas as she had promised, and the homestead had changed in small, particular ways that she had not expected to notice as much as she did. Reuben had expanded the front room, adding a window on the south side that let in the winter afternoon light in a way that made the space warm and open. Thomas had built a work table that he said was for the kitchen, but which was exactly the right height for spreading out survey maps, a coincidence that she chose not to examine too carefully. Christmas on the plains in 1882 was spare and cold and clear, and the most complete she had felt in years. Thomas made a roast, and something approaching a plum pudding that he was deeply proud of regardless of its structural integrity. Reuben had acquired somewhere a set of drawing instruments, a fine boxwood case with brass dividers, and a set of ruling pens that were not inexpensive, and which he gave to her on Christmas morning with the quiet sureness of a man who had given the right gift and knew it. She held the case in her hands and felt the precision of the instruments inside it, and she looked at him across the Christmas morning kitchen table and felt something settle completely in her chest, the way a surveying instrument settles when it finds true level. "You found these in Caldwell," she said. "I ordered them from a supplier in Kansas City," he said, 3 months ago. 3 months ago," she said. "You were not sure I was coming back." "I was hopeful," he said. "Hopeful is almost the same thing." She set the case down on Thomas's work table and crossed the kitchen and kissed him in a way that Thomas, entering with the coffee pot, immediately declared inappropriate for the holiday season and that she ignored entirely. The Nebraska contracts ran from February through May, and by the time she came back to the homestead in June of 1883, the corn was already knee-high and Reuben had broken an additional 40 acres with the help of the neighboring family. The Colemans, Nathan and Sarah, and their 3 children who had come to the homesteading partnership with a team of oxen and a degree of organized farming competence that Thomas openly admired. Sarah Coleman was a compact, decisive woman of 30 who had come to Kansas from Iowa and had strong views about nearly everything, including the state of Dorothy's domestic arrangements, which she expressed with such good-humored directness that Dorothy found herself liking her immediately despite a personality that in other circumstances might have grated. "You need a bigger house," Sarah told Reuben with the bluntness of a woman who had decided they were friends. "2 rooms is not enough for a married couple and a grown man and a working woman who needs a proper office." Reuben looked at Dorothy. "She's not wrong," Dorothy said. "She's not wrong," Thomas agreed from behind his coffee cup. The expansion of the house took the better part of that summer, and it was done the way everything on that homestead was done practically, with everyone contributing what they were best at, without much concern for what was traditionally whose job. Dorothy made the drawings, which she did with the precision of someone for whom spatial representation was a professional skill. Reuben and Nathan Coleman did the heavy framing. Thomas and Sarah's eldest child, a boy of 12 named Daniel who had an aptitude for woodworking that his father lacked, did the finish work. By late September there were 3 bedrooms, a proper front room, a kitchen with the south-facing window that let in the afternoon light, and because Dorothy had been insistent about it, a small room off the main house that served as her office, with enough wall space for a full-size map table and the shelving required for her instruments and documents. On the night the last room was finished and the house was whole, they all sat on the expanded porch, the Reeds, the Colemans, and Dorothy, and watched the summer stars over the Kansas plains and listened to the night sounds, and nobody said very much because there was not much that needed saying. Dorothy sat beside Reuben with his arm around her and her head against his shoulder, and thought about the girl in St. Louis who had been told that her mind was not built for numbers, and about the young woman who had stood outside a land office in 1876 and had her certification questioned by a man who had never done a survey but knew that women were not suited for it, and about the evening she had arrived in Caldwell on a horse that half the town said she had no business riding. and about all the doors that had resisted. And she thought about a man who had shaken her hand in an alley on a Sunday afternoon and simply accepted that she was exactly what she said she was, and had never at any point tried to tell her otherwise. She had said to Sarah Coleman, a few weeks earlier, while they were working in the kitchen garden and discussing the specific subject of men, that Reuben was the only man she had ever known who had not told her what she could not do. Sarah had looked at her with the knowing expression of a woman who had done her own navigating in the world. And, Sarah had said. Dorothy had thought about it for a moment, pulling carrots out of the late summer soil, feeling the specific warmth that came with the thought of him. And I told him, she had said, that it was the most attractive thing a man had ever not said to me. Sarah had laughed and agreed that this was probably the most purely logical thing she had ever heard anyone say about love. The fall of 1883 brought rain, which the corn needed, and the subsequent harvest was better than the previous 2 years combined. Nathan Coleman wrote in his journal, Dorothy would not know this until many years later, that the partnership arrangement had paid off more substantially than any three-family farming arrangement he had heard of in Kansas, and attributed it in part to Dorothy's insistence on treating the land itself as data, on reading the soil and the weather patterns and the water table with the same systematic attention she gave to survey measurements. Reuben told her, one evening in October when the harvest was in and the work had moved from urgent to steady, that he had been thinking about expanding the partnership. There were 2 more families in the area who might be interested, and the combined acreage would be substantial enough to negotiate better prices for supplies and a regular arrangement with the cattle drovers who moved through Caldwell on the trail. Dorothy listened to the plan and asked her questions and added her thoughts, and Reuben incorporated them into the plan and came back 2 days later with a revised version that reflected her points. And she revised it again, and they went back and forth in this way that was not argument but genuine collaboration, until the plan was sharper and more solid than either of them had started with. It was, she thought, an excellent way to build things. Between 2 people who each brought something the other did not have, neither diminishing the other, both becoming larger in the exchange. She was working on a survey contract in late November, a parcel near Winfield, manageable in a week, when she realized that the tiredness she had attributed to the long autumn work season was a different kind of tiredness. She finished the Winfield survey with characteristic accuracy and rode home to the homestead with a mixture of astonishment and a very deep, private happiness. She told Reuben that evening after supper, with the directness that was her way in all things. She said it plainly and watched his face, and what she saw in it was everything she would have hoped for: surprise, and then a flood of warmth that went all the way to the surface, and then the smile, the complete one that changed his whole face, the one she had been collecting since the first time she saw it in a Caldwell restaurant on a Thursday in July of 1882. He reached across the table and took both her hands. He did not say anything for a moment. I did not plan for this quite so soon, she said, with the slight self-consciousness of a woman stating an obvious thing. No, he said, but it's good, it's very good. Thomas, when told, behaved in the way she had come to expect from him, which was to immediately have opinions about names and room arrangements, and to inquire whether they needed him to build more furniture in that order. Sarah Coleman brought over a cake the next day and sat with Dorothy in the kitchen, and talked with practical warmth about what to expect, woman to woman, without sentiment or alarm, which was exactly the conversation Dorothy needed. The pregnancy went normally, with the small inconveniences and larger adjustments that Dorothy navigated with the same systematic pragmatism she brought to everything, though she adapted her field work schedule through the winter to the limitations that practical sense required. Reuben never once suggested she should stop working entirely. He made arrangements, without being asked and without making a point of it, to be available when she needed help and to give her space when she needed to work. He moved through the months of change with the same quality of quiet, attentive presence that had characterized everything she knew about him, and she loved him for it with a completeness that she had not thought love would feel like. Not the turbulent, frightening thing she had expected from novels, but something more like the satisfaction of a measurement that is exactly right. Their son was born in the first week of August, 1884, during a thunderstorm that rolled in off the plains with the abruptness that Kansas weather specialized in, turning the air electric and drumming the roof of the expanded homestead house with a sound like applause. Thomas, who had been dispatched to fetch the doctor from Caldwell, came back through the rain to find that the doctor had not been necessary after all, since Sarah Coleman had been through this 3 times herself and knew exactly what was needed. They named him James. James Wallace Reed, Dorothy's name first, which had been her only condition, and which Reuben had agreed to without a moment's hesitation. James was a loud, definite baby, who announced his presence in every room with the vigor of someone who had important things to communicate, and was impatient with the limitations of early infancy. He had Reuben's dark eyes and Dorothy's particular expression of focused attention that made visitors feel, disconcertingly, that they were being assessed. Nathan Coleman's son Daniel, who came by regularly, and who was developing into a serious and capable young man, declared that the baby looked like he was running calculations, which Thomas felt was the funniest thing anyone had said in the house in months, and which Dorothy felt was probably accurate. She was back at her map table when James was 6 weeks old, working on a survey report for a property dispute in Sumner County. Reuben was in the front room with the baby while she worked, which had become their arrangement, not rigid, not prescribed, but understood. She could hear them through the wall, Reuben talking to James in the low, even voice he used, talking about the corn and the weather and the stars and the long, complicated history of the Kansas plains, with the same quality of attention he gave to everything, as if the baby's being too young to understand was no reason to be less interesting. She set down her pen and sat back in her chair and listened to that voice through the wall, and she felt the particular fullness of a life that had come together the way good surveys come together, not by accident, but by careful attention to what was actually there. The following spring she took on a large contract in the Cherokee Strip, just north of the border, the territory itself, surveying access routes for a proposed road project. It was ambitious work, and the terrain was challenging, and there were political complications with the Cherokee Nation's land rights that Dorothy navigated with the scrupulous attention they deserved, making sure that her survey measurements acknowledged rather than obscured the legal complexities of the land's competing claims. She corresponded with officials of the Cherokee Nation directly, which was not standard practice, and which several of the contract administrators found unnecessary. She did it anyway because the land's actual history mattered to accurate mapping, and because the people whose land it had been deserved the acknowledgement. She was away for 6 weeks that spring, the longest stretch away from the homestead since James had been born, and she came home in May to a son who had learned to pull himself to standing and was deeply proud of it, and a husband who had planted a second kitchen garden in her absence, having apparently developed opinions about vegetables that he had been absorbing from Thomas and Sarah by proximity. She stood at the garden fence and looked at the neat rows with their small, earnest green shoots coming up in the May sun, and she thought that a man who plants a kitchen garden while his wife is away is expressing something in the language of gardens that she found entirely moving. "When did you become interested in gardens?" she asked. "Thomas is a very compelling advocate," he said from behind her. She laughed and turned, and he was standing in the kitchen doorway holding James, who had made his feelings about her return abundantly clear and had now settled into a warm, consolidated satisfaction against his father's shoulder. "I have another contract inquiry," she said. "Colorado again. Different area northwest of Denver, more complex terrain." She watched his face. "It would be 2 months, possibly 3. "We'll be here," he said, not waiting. She noticed. Here there was a difference. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm going." She went, and she came back, and she went again, and she always came back. And the homestead grew, and the partnership grew, and the children grew. James was followed in 1887 by a daughter they named Me, after Reuben's mother, who came into the world with the same definite presence as her brother, but a quality of serene watchfulness that was entirely her own. And 3 years later, another son, Henry, who had Dorothy's coloring and Reuben's temperament, and showed from very early an interest in the horses that kept Thomas cheerfully occupied with the business of keeping the child off horses he was not yet old enough to ride. Dorothy Wallace Reed's reputation as a surveyor grew steadily through the latter part of the 1880s and into the 1890s, extending well beyond Kansas. She was commissioned by the Kansas State Legislature in 1888 to review and correct historical survey discrepancies in 5 southern counties, a project that took 18 months and produced a set of maps that were used by the State Land Office for the next 40 years. She was one of 3 surveyors consulted in an 1891 court case about railroad land grants in the Cherokee Strip that went all the way to the Federal Circuit Court, and her testimony about survey methodology and historical accuracy was cited in the final decision. She built a practice, based out of the homestead but extending wherever the work called, that made her name known in professional circles, and that earned the grudging respect even of men who had spent their careers insisting there was no place for women in the discipline. She was never particularly interested in their respect or their reluctance about it, which Reuben observed was probably the most effective response available. Elias Birchfield died in 1889, his cattle operation having contracted rather than expanded in the years since the survey dispute, a circumstance that nobody on the Reed homestead discussed with anything that could be called satisfaction, because that was not the kind of people they were. Mercer Crane, who was more intelligent than Birchfield and had learned the right lessons from the 1882 case, became over the years a decent enough lawyer who occasionally recommended Dorothy's survey work to clients who needed someone accurate and credible. Hal Pickett retired from the Caldwell Land Office in 1891 and bought a small house on the edge of town and spent his afternoons fishing in Bitter Creek. He and Dorothy remained, in the way of people who have been through something real together, on terms of genuine mutual regard. Thomas Reed married in 1886 a woman named Clara from Wichita who was a school teacher and who regarded Thomas with the patient amusement that seemed to be the natural response to him among the women who knew him best. They built their own house on the northeast corner of the homestead property, which Nathan Coleman helped with, and Clara set up the first proper school within 5 miles of Caldwell, in a building that the combined homestead partnership constructed on a Saturday afternoon, the summer before James was old enough to attend. The Coleman children grew up alongside the Reed children, and Daniel Coleman, who had shown his carpentry aptitude as a boy, became by his mid-20s the best builder in the county, which meant that several of the improvements to the Reed homestead over the years, the proper barn, the extended porch, the small schoolroom addition when Clara's enrollment grew beyond the original building's capacity, were his work, executed with the care of someone who considered it both professional and personal. Dorothy surveyed the land and came home to the people on it, and the land and the people on it became the thing she was measuring everything else against. She had been a woman who kept moving because staying put had meant being defined by other people's limits, and she had found, in this particular staying put, that it was the most expansive thing she had ever done, a center from which she could go everywhere, because the center held. In the summer of 1895, Dorothy and Reuben rode up to the ridge above Bitter Creek on a Sunday evening, the way they had fallen into the habit of doing in all the years since the first time. The homestead below them had grown considerably. The larger house, the good barn, the vegetable gardens that Thomas and Sarah maintained in their running friendly competition, the cornfield stretching out toward the Coleman's place, the well that had been replaced and deepened twice as the operation grew. James was 11 and already showing a curiosity about her surveying instruments that she was finding both touching and entirely familiar. Me was 8 and deeply interested in horses and in the opinions of horses, which Henry, at 6, shared with the enthusiasm of a boy who felt that horses were fundamentally his primary constituency. Clara Reed's school had 12 students in it, and she had written to the county education office about a permanent teacher's salary, which Dorothy expected she would get because Clara was not a woman who did not get things she pursued. They sat on the ridge, and the Kansas sunset did what Kansas sunsets did, enormous and specific and generous with color, and Reuben had his arm around her the way it always found its way there, and she had her head against his shoulder the way it always found its way there. "James asked me today if he could come on a survey," she said. "He wants to learn to use the chain." "What did you tell him?" "I told him yes. Next spring when the weather is right I'll take him out on the Sumner County work and show him how." Reuben was quiet for a moment. "He's going to be good at it." "He might be," she said. "He might be something else entirely, but he's going to have the choice." She felt his arm tighten slightly around her, the small acknowledging pressure of a man who understood exactly what she meant. "They're all going to have the choice. Me already has opinions about it," he said. "Me already has opinions about everything. She's 8 going on 45. He laughed. It was still the same laugh it had always been, genuine and unhurried, the laugh of a man who found the specific texture of his specific life genuinely good. "Do you ever think about what would have happened," she said, "if Birchfield's men in the alley had done their job properly and you had already left by the time I came around the corner?" "I've thought about it," he said. "Usually I try not to. I would have gone back to the hotel and sent a message to Pickett and had a perfectly professional survey process and never met you until the dispute was resolved, and probably left for Colorado that same week. Probably." She looked at the plains below, at the last light on the grass and the distant line of trees along the creek. "I was so determined to keep moving." "I know," he said. "You still do. You just know what you're moving back to." She thought about that for a long time. The keeping of the thread that led home. The way freedom and belonging had turned out not to be opposites after all, but something more like the two ends of the same measurement. You could not know where you were unless you had somewhere to measure from. She had been measuring from here for 13 years and the measurements kept coming out right. "Reuben," she said. "Yes," he said. "Thank you," she said. Not specifically for any single thing. For the whole of it. For shaking her hand in an alley and asking her for accuracy. For listening. For the kitchen garden and the Christmas instruments and the building of a home that was also a launch point. For being, in all of this, simply and completely himself. He turned and looked at her, and the sunset was behind her, and his expression was the one she had been reading for 13 years and still found new things in, and he said, "Thank you," back to her with the same unhurried directness. "For what?" she asked. "For coming back," he said. "Every time." She kissed him on the ridge above Bitter Creek as the stars began to appear, one by one, over the enormous Kansas sky, and below them the homestead settled into its evening, the lamps coming on in the windows, the sound of children calling each other in from the dusk, the particular, irreplaceable music of a life that had been built with care and love and accurate measurements, and the radical decision, made by two specific people on a warm Sunday afternoon in 1882, to recognize each other exactly as they were. The plains were wide and dark and extraordinary around them, and the night smelled of grass and cottonwood, and the good working soil of a farm that had been made out of uncertainty and stubbornness and hope. And Dorothy Wallace Reed held her husband's hand on their ridge above their creek in their corner of Kansas and felt, as she had felt the first day she had stood in an open field with a surveying chain in her hands, and understood what she was made for, completely and essentially possible.